Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. We're going the not the most direct route. We're going the long but pretty route on this talk, or as the joke has it, if I were going there, I wouldn't start from here. So the prologue. In his will, John Milstead made a series of what sound to our ears strange bequests. For example, I give unto Edward Milstead, my son, 5 shillings of good and lawful money of England to be paid unto him within 1 month or next after my decease. And I give to the said Edward my great chest standing in the chamber whereas I do lay. Second, I give unto Martha, my daughter, the sum of £4. And I give unto her my little brass pot. Lucky girl, brass pot. And so it goes on, a series of bequests to members of his family. Perhaps this doesn't sound quite so strange if I tell you where and when this takes place. The date was 1623, and the place was Thurston in Kent, which is about 5 miles west of Ashford. This is St. Margaret's Church, where the records are kept for that family. John Milstead was my 9 times great-grandfather. He had 12 children, 8 of whom were alive at the time of his death. And the next 10 generations were all born in Kent. The last of these, my maternal grandfather, was born in Ospringe, near Faversham, the Ospringe Church, some similarities with the other one, in 1883. So the family had moved about 18 miles in 260 years. For those of you of a financial bent, the rough equivalents, and it is very rough, £1 back then is worth about £1,000 today. John Milstead made specific bequests to members of his family worth about £50,000 in today's terms. So he clearly wasn't a pauper. Now, if only things were that simple on my paternal grandfather's side. But Patrick Stanley was born in Roscommon, which is the area shaded in the dark green, pretty much in the middle. And if you've spent any time researching ancestors from Ireland, you will understand the significance of the title of this talk. It was, of course, inspired by President Kennedy's speech in September 1962, when he committed the Americans to a moon landing. Him, I think, just finishing the speech. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Quite. Let's deliberately do something which is difficult. Well, I started to thinking, well, how hard was it? At the time he made his speech, the American space program was not in great shape. Of their 17 unmanned flights, 6 were successes, 6 were partial successes, and 5 were failures. This slide shows what is known as the 4-inch flight, because that's how far it managed to get off the launching pad. They'd managed to put 2 men in orbit, had a total time in space of 10 hours. So I concluded that if JFK had been, to use the phrase currently much in vogue, following the science, then frankly, he'd have been better off talking about something else. But however, hard doesn't equal impossible, and we all know what happened. Less than 8 years later, we have this, the grainy shot of Neil Armstrong going down the lunar lander in July 1969. So let me explain a couple of the difficulties for the benefit of those who've not had occasion to delve into Irish genealogy. This picture, which I think has been photo enhanced for extra colour, shows the fire at the Public Records Office in Dublin in 1922 during the Irish Civil War. The census returns from the 19th century were all destroyed. You might think that it's frustrating that quite a lot of wartime records from the First World War were destroyed in a fire in the Blitz in London in 1940. But think how much more frustrating it is to be missing 60 years of family records. Broadly speaking, 2 to 2.5 generations minimum. Secondly, civil registration only started in Ireland in 1866, some 30 years after England. And it does appear that compliance with the rules wasn't very great to start with. It appears the mere fact that an edict had come from England was enough to prompt a slow response. You appear to have this, dragged, kicking and screaming, certainly unwilling. So, are we downhearted? Well, absolutely not. It's a challenge, isn't it? The fact that so many records are missing has forced people to become more creative. And I'll give examples a little bit later on. The next slide here has significant implications for the search. In 1841, the population of Roscommon was 254,000. Now, Roscommon has an area very similar to that of Staffordshire. In the next decade, it dropped 32%. It dropped 80,000 as a direct and indirect result of the Great Famine. In Kilbride Parish, where I have family roots, the drop was even more dramatic, down 45% in those 10 years, almost every other person. And it continued to fall by the end of the century down to about 100,000 and continued to fall, reaching a low point in about 1990, just over 50,000. So imagine, if you will, the entire area of Staffordshire with only 50,000 people in it. At the time, the population of Ireland was about 8 million, about half that of England, which was reckoned to be about 16 million. The statistics are difficult to be certain of, as I've already said. Civil registration hadn't started, but it's conservatively estimated that 1 million people died of starvation. About 2.5 million people at least emigrated. And these are the ones that can be found. Well, sometimes they can be found. So where do we look? This map shows the where concentrations of Irish are to be found. And the darker the green, the more Irish you find. I have to admit to being a little bit surprised how many were in South America, but the second half of the 19th century coincides with the railway mania. There was a gold discovered in Australia in the 1850s, in California slightly earlier, and this explains why so many people went. The next slide breaks that down a little bit more in terms of the destination for people. And you can clearly see there that America is by far the dominant area, and it's not difficult to see why. The most famous place that people headed, of course, is Ellis Island, where I think 8 million people passed through the doors whilst it was open. And Kennedy's family went in that direction. Now, if emigration was to distant places like America and Australia, then there are passenger lists to look at. This is an extract from one particular passenger list where it tells you at the top where people were coming from, it tells where they're heading to, Massachusetts, and which berth they were in. And if you notice at the bottom there that husband and wife were separated. So there's no sort of cabins for families. You know, the women were in one cabin, the men were in others, and they were kept apart until they arrived. Of course, there's also arrival records. So here you have one. Thomas Stanley arrived in Boston, June 1890 on the Catalonia. Tells you he comes from Ireland, tells you he's in good health. Okay, the thing, of course, to be careful of is that the combination of a thick Irish accent heard by an immigration officer who may only have been an immigrant themselves a few years before does make for significant distortion. In fact, the O'Kennedys became Kennedy at that time, and there's various other simplifications and mangling of names. That's just the way it is. When people had arrived, there's quite a lot of people trying to find out what happened to other members of their family. This is an extract from a newspaper called the Boston Pilot of members of Stanley families trying to link up with other people they know have come. The light flashing on me. And it tells you where the relatives are looking and what's going on. This website used to be free access. Unfortunately, it's been acquired, I think, by Ancestry, and you now need a subscription to find it. But again, it's telling you of people who are there, other people who are there, the relationship between them. But of course, no such records of emigration were kept if people were going to England, because England was regarded as the same country at that time. And the same applies for Canada and Australia. There were no comprehensive lists of immigrants to Canada until 1865, and for Australia only from 1924, which did surprise me because prior to that it wasn't their direct responsibility. Okay, when they've arrived, naturalization records to be looked at, and this is the same Thomas J. Stanley. He said he was going to Massachusetts, and he ends up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, giving you date of birth. Some of the information, of course, because it's done many years later, can be a little bit flaky, as memories have a habit of playing tricks on people. Once your relatives have gone overseas, there are census reports, census returns to look at. And here we have, difficult to see, I appreciate on the screen, right at the bottom here, we have a record of a Bridget Simpson, who is a widow. She's the head of the family. And then there's, I think, Bridget, the daughter, and I'm not actually sure, I think it's John at the bottom there. And they are in Massachusetts. So whilst the Irish records were there, we do have the local records. And of course, what you tend to find is you find one and there's a bit of a cluster. They do tend to stick together. Marriage records. Here's a marriage record, and I have to say this is even worse reproduction, but I'm sorry about that. I'll have to work on that. Where again, you're finding people with a maiden name. This one is actually William Simpson marrying Bridget, his wife, who was born Stanley. So again, we've got information which is useful. Marriage records obviously show fathers' names, and this particular one also shows the maiden name as well, like many records do, but not all of them. Birth records. Here we've got again, down at the bottom there, we've got a Simpson, and it tells you it's Bridget, but born Stanley. Useful if your relatives married before they emigrated and you're not quite sure what the mother's maiden name was. The birth record in the locality will quite often tell you. As I said, that one's Edward, son of Bridget and Edward Simpson, named after his father. Death records. This one I did find unusually interesting. This is Bridget Simpson dying, and it tells you not only her father's name, but her mother's name as well, which really is quite useful from my point of view, which is a pity we don't have that on some of our records. So we now know that Bridget Stanley, her father was John, and her mother was Winifred, born Kenny.